All right, so we just learned about how we handle data flowing in and out and through our system. All right, so the next important topic we need to talk about when it comes to terms of data and I/O is how we handle or how we interact with the file system. And this is very important, right? Because if we think about it, when we get a request from the client to the server, in addition to serving or executing code and logic, we oftentimes need to pull static content such as files and images and CSS files from the file system. So Node gives us an interface or a module that we call the FS module, and this module allows us to interact with the file system. It gives us all the APIs that we need, such as open, read, write, all the things that we're going to need to interact with our file system. All right. Now, the key to this module is knowing that you need to require FS in order to work with the file system, which is something that we worked with before. All right, so one of the things we need to understand first before we start to work with these files is what it means or how we access a file system. And we have two ways of doing that, or two forms, synchronous and asynchronous, right? So we've already talked about those concepts earlier. So let's go through them again real quick. So when we do a synchronous file access, what happens is the file system request blocks until the call is completed, and then control is going to be released back to the thread. So when I request to open a file, then processing is going to stop right there until I do what I'm going to do with that file or till it's open. And then once it's open and everything's good to go, then processing is going to go to the next line of code. All right. Now, what's our problem with that? Well, it's pretty straightforward and easy to use in Node.js, but you may experience some performance issues, right? Because you're blocking. And remember, Node has that main event thread that's possibly running. So we may block that main event thread and we can't get any more requests in, or we may have too many threads running because of our file handles. All right. The other approach would be the asynchronous approach to reading files. And what we're going to do here is we're going to make the call to open the file, and we're going to pass it or put it in the event queue to process later. Well, what's the drawback of that? It gets kind of tricky because everything's going to keep running. So if we're dependent on that data, then it may not be available to us when we're trying to process it, right? So we have to pay close attention to when we're using asynchronous calls to read files from the file system. All right. Now, here's some important differences between synchronous and asynchronous calls to the file system. Asynchronous calls are going to require you to put in a callback function, right? Because we want some code to handle what happens once the file is open. So we're going to need a callback function as an extra parameter, all right? Asynchronous calls automatically handle exceptions for us, which is great because what's going to happen is it's going to pass in an error object when an error occurs, all right? And we'll take a look at that. So to handle that, and to handle exceptions in synchronous calls, we got to use try-catch blocks. All right. Synchronous calls run immediately, which is good, but execution does not return until they complete. All right. Synchronous calls get placed on that event queue, and execution returns to the running thread, so it doesn't block. Remember that. But the actual call does not execute until it's picked up by the main event loop. All right. All right. So let's look at how we read some files. So let's go here to file read. All right, so here we're going to require our FS file, our FS module. All right, then we're going to set our encoding option. So we're going to use an object here and set the encoding to UF8, and our flag is going to be read. So this tells the FS module that our text is going to be formatting UTF-8 and that we should read the file. All right, so here we have our first method, which is read file. All right, so if you look at this, what type of call is this? Is this synchronous or asynchronous? You're correct. This is asynchronous because we pass this callback function here that tells the code what to do once the file is read. All right, so let's take a look at this. This first argument is going to be the path to our file. So we're pointing to a file that's in a folder one level up called data. Right, so there it is, and a file called config.txt. So we open that, we just see that it has a JSON string in there, containing max files in the object 20, max connections 15, and root path is rep root. All right, so we go back to our file. All right, so we're going to pass that as the first argument. We're going to pass our options as the second argument because we want it to be UTF-8, and we're going to read. Now we're going to pass it our callback function. So let's take a look at what our callback function does. All right, remember I said that if you're using asynchronous, it's going to pass in an error object. All right, it's going to pass in two things as it reads each part of data. It's going to pass in the error object, and it's going to pass in the data. So if I want to make sure that I don't have an error, I'm going to use if error. So remember, if error is an object, it will return true. So this says if this error object that's passed in is populated, then we're going to write to the console failed to open config file. Or else, if error is not null, meaning it is null, meaning I don't have an error, I'm going to write to the console that I've loaded it. I'm going to parse that data, all right, stored in an object called config, and then I'm going to print the values to the screen. So here I'm using my JSON parse that we saw earlier. All right, so pretty straightforward. Let's take a look at another synchronous read. All right, so here we're importing our module. We're specifying that we want to open the file synchronously. So notice this is a different way of opening it. Open and sync, right? So open the file for synchronous reading. The first argument is going to be the file path, and the second argument is going to be how we want to read it. All right, and that's going to return back a file descriptor for us. So notice in the other approach, we did not get back a file descriptor because we don't need it because our callback function is handling it. Here, we get back a file descriptor. All right, so we're creating a variable called veggies, which is an empty string, and we got a loop here. All right, so here we're going to create a buffer. We're going to fill the buffer, and then we're going to read the data from the file into our buffer. Right? We're going to get back the bytes, and then we're going to read the bytes and print that to the screen. We're going to take that buffer, call toString on it so we get the actual string, and concatenate it with veggies. And we're going to keep doing this as long as we have bytes, as long as bytes is greater than 0. All right? A lot of extra work here that we get that we don't have to do when we do it asynchronously. I'm sorry. Now, the key to remember is when you do open sync, you need to do a close sync. So this is really similar to the traditional method of reading a file that you saw back in COP 1000. All right. All right. And here's another async example. So importing our FS module. And here we're creating the function, right? So we're going to do two things here that are slightly different. We're going to create the callback function as a regular function, and then we're going to create an anonymous function or a callback function that essentially just calls that function. All right, makes our code a little bit more readable. All right, so what does this read fruit function do? Well, it takes the file descriptor, it takes the fruits, and then it creates the buffer, reads the buffer, fills the buffer. Then we're using the read method to do a further asynchronous read on the file. Right, we know it's asynchronous because we have our callback function here. All right, and if the bytes are greater than 0, it's going to print the bytes and keep appending to fruits and keep calling itself recursively. All right, or else we're going to close the file. All right, and log fruits to the system. All right, and there's our actual open method. We pass it all our information, and our callback function calls read fruit. All right, so what I want you to do is study these different methods of opening. So you'll see a document in the reading that has you study the different methods of opening and reading a file. All right. All right, so writing to a file. Oh, this is another good one. So remember we talked about streams. All right, so here's an approach where we use an actual stream to read our file. So we're going to import our FS module, create our options. All right, and here we're going to use the create read stream method to create a stream on this data. And this is good because it's going to read the data in chunks and not all at one time. All right, so of course, because we're reading it in chunks, well, we want to handle the on data event. So we're going to say on like we did before. So anytime any new data comes in from the stream, we're going to take that chunk. Here's our callback function. We're going to take that chunk and we're going to write it. All right, and then on close, we're just going to say the file is closed. So this is actually what I would say is the preferred way of working with files because it allows us to stream, especially if you're working with videos. It allows you to stream or buffer that content that's coming across. All right, let's take a quick look at writing. All right, so we can write asynchronously or we can write synchronously. So let's look at sync. All right, so we're going to use our FS module. We're going to create an array called veggie tray to hold some values. Then we're going to open the file for sync reading, passing it the path, and we're going to use our W option to write with. All right, and while our veggie tray dot length, so while we still have values in our array, we're going to pop the value and append an empty string to it and store it in the variable veggie. Then we're going to use write sync to write that value, passing in the value and the file handle so that we can write it. And then we're going to write the bytes to the string that we've written so far. And remember, once we open it sync, we need to close it sync. All right. And again, notice there's no callback in this approach. All right. So there's our async version. All right. So we're writing out our function here. It's pretty much doing the same thing, right? Only difference is we're passing in that callback function right there. All right. Pretty good stuff. All right, so there's other things that we may need to do besides reading or writing a file, such as actually listing the files on the file system, finding out information about the file, deleting a file from the file system, making and removing directories. So a lot of the things that we can do with the os.sys module in Python, we can actually still do with Node.js. So I've included some data samples for that for you to peruse and check out. So this one is actually how we create folders. All right, now here's one of the issues that you're going to run into with Node.js. Notice that nested series of callbacks, right? So that's why I have a tendency to create my named functions and pass those functions into my callbacks to make my code a little bit cleaner to see, because it can get a little nested and ugly in there. All right, here's an example of reading the files or listing the files from a directory, so you can walk through that. Notice this is a recursive call. All right, getting information about a file. All right, so you can peruse those and actually checking if a file exists on the file system. All right, so review those and review the reading and let me know if you have any questions. Take care.